How's it going, guys? My name is Ethan Salgado. For those of you who don't know me, Ryan has given me the opportunity today to come in and share my testimony and also fulfill my lifelong dream of becoming a YouTube star. So here I am. I didn't have too much time or too much advance notice to prepare, but you guys know I don't usually think too much before I speak anyway, so this should be just like normal. Anyways, guys, my testimony is probably a bit relatable to a lot of you guys. You know, there wasn't much of an aha moment or a big, light bulb, so to speak, but it was more of a gradual progression. I was raised in a family of new believers. My mom was raised Judaic and my dad was raised Catholic, and they had just recently found a church about right before they had my older brother. And by the time that I came into the picture, they were about 4 years into it and were on fire and taught me kind of everything that I knew. But, it was, for those of you who do know me, you also know that I don't like to learn things the easy way. So it was more of this is what you should do, and that wasn't really enough for me. I needed to know more of like why, or what would happen if I didn't, and all those things that a young stubborn kid likes to ponder about. So when I got older, I of course tried to push the lines and the boundaries and test things, and I found myself in bad crowds with people that I shouldn't have been hanging out with, probably because they didn't see things the way that I saw them, at least when it comes to my religion and my relationship with God. And that led me to experience a lot of things and have a lot of, difficulty and tribulations that I had to overcome that I wouldn't have had to overcome if I had just, listened to my parents and read the Word more and kind of dived myself a little bit more into what I believed. And so I guess my aha moment, if I was to have one or specify one, was finally when I was struggling a lot with understanding my walk with God and trying to understand who God was. I was able to go to Hume. Woo-hoo! I know you guys all know Hume. Fortunately, couldn't really do it this year, but we'll have to go again when this whole thing clears up. But I had a very great time there, and I got to really connect again with my community, I guess, is what really helped me with my walk, was my friends that were part of the church. Shout out to Jacob Dunnance and Andrew Collins. They were like my real good first church friends, and they kind of taught me, I hope they don't see this, it's gonna go to their head, but they kind of taught me that you could have fun and you could enjoy life while also walking a path close to God. And that was something that was really foreign to me because my parents, like I said, were really on fire, and something that happens sometimes to new believers is that they start to focus a little bit too much on the rules and less about the relationship with God. And so I kind of saw my relationship with God as like a handbook, like a guidebook of rules to follow and things that I shouldn't do. And that for a kid makes things really, I hate to say it, but it felt really boring and forced. And so after I had developed that relationship with my church community and my church friends, I got to kind of see how much of a difference it made in my life. And I got to see how God's Word wasn't just rules to follow, and it wasn't just, a boring sense of obligation. It was actually something to give me happiness. I actually saw that I was happier and having more fun when I was doing things that I knew weren't against God, and in turn weren't against myself. And so after that, when I came back down from the mountain and Hume and everything, I got more involved. I got to, participate in more of the church activities. We got to do VPS, and I got to do a Live LA experience where we got to sleep in a church in the inner city, and we got to hang out with the kids of that inner city and kind of teach them about God. And we actually slept in there on bunk beds. So we really got to immerse ourselves in the whole experience. And I noticed that also a big part of what made me feel closer to God was being able to hang out with awesome guys like you know, guys and girls, you know, the younger generation, so to speak. And I guess because I got so much out of youth group, it made me feel really good to give that back. And so you guys are also, I guess, to be honest, not to be cheesy, but you guys are part of my walk as well. You know, being able to help you out or tell you my mistakes and not to repeat them, it in turn makes me and reminds me of the things that I learned as I grew up. So yeah, thanks for being a part of that. And that, in short, I suppose, is my testimony.
One of my favorite seasons of my entire life is when I was working winter camps up at Hume Lake. If you guys have never been up to Hume Lake or the mountains during like a winter storm or after a winter storm, it is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. But there was one time, okay? I was at home at my parents' house in Orange County, and I was driving back to Hume. And I was just dumb. And I decided, yeah, I could probably leave. I could leave Orange County to go back to Hume at like, I don't know, 8 p.m. I'll get up there at like, I don't know, it'll be like 3 or 4 o'clock. That's fine, it's not a big deal. It was winter time, and I knew that there was a big storm, so I was like, whatever. So I was driving, and the first like 4.5 hours or 5 hours of the drive is just freeway, it's not a big deal. And then you get to the foot of the mountain. If you guys have been to Hume, you know what this feels like. Going up the mountain can be pretty intense. There are some really scary moments, even in the summer, where you know it's like down to one lane, there's no guardrail, it's just a steep drop off the mountain. But I had driven this 100 times in my life, right? So I knew these roads, I knew it really well. I knew the road really well. So I was like, I'm gonna be fine. I was not. I was not fine. I got to the mountains and it was, first of all, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, which is a terrible time for you to be driving. And the snow was melting and freezing on the ice. So the road was so slippery. Not only that, there was huge fog and clouds, so you couldn't see farther than like 2 or 3 feet in front of you. And I have like an hour left of my drive to go from the bottom hill to the top of the hill, and I couldn't see and I couldn't drive. I remember I was driving like 25 miles an hour, which is kind of the speed limit when there's snow. And about 6 or 7 minutes into the drive up the mountain, my car lost traction. And I was going up, and then all of a sudden I could feel the back of my car moving, and I didn't want it to move that way, and I did like a 90-degree spin. And I was so spooked. And because it was so scary, I decided that I was just gonna keep going, which was the wrong decision. I was like, I'm gonna be fine. It happened one time. That drive, which normally takes like 45 minutes from there to there, took me 3 hours at 3 o'clock in the morning because I kept sliding and I couldn't see. It was one of the scariest, most frightening, fearful few hours of my entire life. I made countless wrong decisions in those moments and wish that I had made a billion decisions differently that night. Eventually, as you guys can see, I made it up there and I was fine, but I was so scared. And that fear is something that I think all of us on some level have experienced. We've all felt the fear of of, I don't know, maybe you've feared for your life, or you've been scared because somebody scared you. But this fear that we experience, not just a life or death fear, fear prevents us and keeps us from a lot of things in life. Fear, it may keep you up at night. Maybe you're afraid of something. Maybe it's a relational fear, or a task that you have to complete, or a grade that you're trying to get, or a conversation you need to have. These things can keep you up keep you up at night. Fear has prevented or hurt some of our friendships because you're too afraid to say something you need to say, or you're too afraid that something you did say got taken the wrong way. And so fear sometimes prevents us from trying new things. We're too afraid of what other people are going to think, or what happens if we fail. Today, we're continuing in our series called Vibes, and talking about this emotion of fear. What do we do when we are fearful, and what is fear? How do we deal with it? Fear is human. Everybody who is human experiences fear. And there's two sides to fear. There's this scary fear where we think we're going to die, or we're concerned for what other people think of us. But on those same feelings of fear on the positive side are the same things that help us to dream and imagine and experience things in our minds that are positive. And so both of those things are good, and both of those things are important. Actually, fear is actually a really important part of human nature. Fear is a huge part of why humans have been able to become so successful in this world, because we recognize things that are dangerous in our lives and stay away from those things. So fear is not always a bad thing. So we're going to dive in and look at this topic of fear, and fortunately, the Bible has a lot to say about fear. Actually, the commandment, like fear not or do not be afraid, is the most frequent commandment in the New Testament. Do you know that? That angels and disciples and Jesus multiple times says, do not be afraid. And for us, we hear those words, and when we look at those stories, often when we study them, we only look at one story at a time, and we look at those phrases where it says fear not in isolation, and we read those things and we feel like it feels impossible. Like maybe you're fearful right now. I don't know what's going on in your life. Maybe somebody is sick and you're afraid. That's fine. So when the Bible says, hey, I recognize that situation, fear not, it just feels like, that doesn't feel like a realistic commandment. That doesn't feel like something that makes sense for us to do, right? We can't just take our fear and turn it off, right? So what do we do about those things? The reason why when we hear the phrase fear not feels like an impossible thing is because we're not looking at the whole picture. There are many isolated events where Jesus tells people not to be afraid. And when we look at those things as a whole, we get a better understanding of what it looks like for us not to fear. Jesus says this to his disciples in Matthew 10, verse 16. He says this. He says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. I don't know if you know the relationship between sheep and wolves, but sheep are prey, wolves are predators, wolves eat sheep. Jesus is saying you're going to be the sheep, which means you're going to be hunted, people are going to be after you, you're going to be afraid. That seems like a crazy thing for Jesus to say, that should strike fear into our lives in a normal situation. But as we look back and we understand Jesus' message of fear leading up to that statement, we understand better how Jesus is able to say that, and the disciples are able to digest that in a good way. It's part of a bigger story. So I'm going to flip back a little bit here. In Matthew 8, we're going to see a few of these examples of where Jesus is addressing the issue of fear in the lives of the disciples. The first one is in Matthew 8:24. The disciples and Jesus take this field trip. Jesus and his boys are in a boat, and this huge storm comes. Maybe you've heard this story, right? There's a storm, and they're in a boat, and the waves are crashing, the wind is howling, and the disciples think that they're going to die. And so they're freaking out, and they wake up Jesus And verse 24 says this. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. That's hilarious to me, first of all, that Jesus could just sleep through it. Verse 25, the disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And this is Jesus' response. He wakes up and he replies, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Crazy story, right? A little bit hard to believe, but here's the story. That the waves and the sea and the wind caused fear in the lives of the disciples. And Jesus proved in that moment when he calmed the seas that who is bigger and what is bigger, the fear that those disciples had or Jesus. The point that he made was no matter how scary the circumstances are, whatever situation that you are in, Jesus has the power to stay calm and calm the seas. Okay? Remember, we're just putting all of these things in context. So that's one story addressing fear. Let's put that one aside and let's go ahead and flip over to Matthew 10:28. And this is where Jesus is talking to his disciples again. And this is where he says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body. What is Jesus saying here? He's saying, hey, if you're going to be afraid of anything, at least be afraid of the right thing. At least be afraid of the thing that is worth being afraid of. Because even this body, even the lives that we have, those things are temporary and Jesus has control over those things. The real fear that we should have is that we would be eternally separated from God, eternally separated from Jesus. That is worth being fearful over. Right? Next verse, verse 29 says this. It says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So do not be afraid. There it is again. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. This is an incredibly encouraging passage, right? What this passage is saying, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, that these 2 seemingly worthless and abundant birds, which you can find everywhere and all over the place, every single one of them is taken care of by the Father. And we are infinitely more valuable to the Father than even those birds, so much so that the very hairs on our head are completely numbered. That no matter what we're afraid of, no matter the circumstances in our lives, we can know that Jesus is paying attention to us. That he knows your situation and is with you in the midst of the situation. And that's why we don't need to be afraid. We don't need to be afraid because we're not going to be cared for, but we can have confidence knowing that Jesus is with us in those moments. Flipping ahead, Matthew 14, verse 27, there's another field trip and they're back on the water. Jesus and his boys are back in the ocean, and Jesus says, okay, why don't you guys go out on the water and I'll meet you guys there. And so they're out there and it's kind of dark and they see something off in the distance in the water, and it's actually Jesus, right? This is the part where Peter goes to walk in the water. And this is where Jesus addresses them, Matthew 14, 27. He says this. He said, but Jesus immediately said to them, because they were freaking out, right? They saw this thing out into the distance and they're like, I think it's a ghost. They're freaking out. And Jesus says, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Very quickly, we see 3 instances of Jesus telling his disciples, hey, do not be afraid. But why are we able to not be afraid? It's because that Jesus, no matter the circumstances, is able to stay calm and calm the situation. Jesus is paying attention to you and I. That He knows every intimate detail about our lives and knows us and loves us and cares for us. And that even when we're afraid, we can have courage because Jesus is there with us. And this lesson of not being afraid, of not having fear, culminates and meets this incredible climax at the resurrection. The first thing Jesus says after he rises from the dead is to not be afraid, and he proves in that moment that not only is he bigger than our situations, but he's greater and bigger than death. We see this play out in Peter's life better than anyone. That these disciples, right, we just looked at a few passages. There's so many passages of the disciples being afraid and fearful, right? When Jesus was being crucified, Peter was so afraid to the point where he was denying that he ever even knew Jesus. He didn't want to be associated with him at all. But we see something happen after the resurrection in Peter's life, where he goes from being ashamed and afraid to claim the name of Jesus to being fully sold out to the point of being killed for his own life. And something happens in the resurrection. What happens is Peter loses his fear because he understands that Jesus is bigger than anything we could fear in this world. There's nothing to be afraid of because Jesus is clearly bigger than whatever it is, the thing that you're afraid of. So what is that in your life that you're afraid of right now? There's a lot of things to be afraid of. There's sickness and disease. There's being afraid of what's going to happen when we come back to normal life, or what normal life is even going to look like. There's fear for the friends that you have, the things that are being said, the relationships that you have. There's so many things to be afraid of, but none of those things cannot be calmed by Jesus, and none of those things are bigger than who Jesus is. So we don't need to live our lives in fear like Peter did pre-resurrection. But instead we can live in confidence like Peter does after the resurrection, knowing that Jesus is bigger than every problem that we could ever have. He says this, Peter says this later on in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. He says this. He says, "Cast all of your anxieties and fears on him, for he cares for you." And the reason why I love that Peter is the one that says this is because we see that he has done this in his own life. That when there's something that is causing you fear, what he's saying is you can take those fears and give them and throw them and cast them to Jesus because he is bigger than those things. And we can have confidence because of those things. So here's my challenge for you guys. What are you fearful of? The first step for us to in order for us to cast our fears onto Jesus is to recognize the things that we are afraid of. So what are those things? I want you to literally write them down. Write down the things that you're afraid of. And this next thing is, once you have written those things down, I want you to cast them to Jesus. That you take that piece of paper and you continue writing and saying, this thing that I'm afraid of, Jesus, I give this to you. I recognize that you are bigger than these circumstances. You are bigger than this situation. And because of that, I can have confidence and not live in fear. And once you have done that, I want you to, in your small groups today, I want you to talk about those things with your leader. We don't have to live in fear. We don't need to let fear be the boss of our lives. That we can have good vibes and good vibes only because we can have freedom from fear in this life when we have confidence that Jesus is bigger than every single fear we could ever have. Love you guys.